Alien films are a dime a dozen, but there's something uniquely interesting about Steven Spielberg returning to the world of UFOs with Disclosure Day, his 36th feature film. The Beard is a born entertainer, and he's left his mark on Hollywood in more ways than we can count, but several of his landmark movies, and even some of his less beloved ones, have circled back to the idea that when it comes to the universe, we may not be alone. The man has directed everything from monster movies to historical dramas, but why do Spielberg's alien films in particular make him such a fascinating filmmaker? Maybe it's that his UFO pictures all feel completely different, or maybe it's that they share similar themes despite those big differences. Either way, we have to ask, what does it mean for an artist to return to the same well repeatedly for over 60 years, even as the world around him changes, and so does he? Spielberg's tryst with Extra Terrestrials dates back to his very first theatrical feature. No, Sugarland Express doesn't secretly have aliens watching the drama from off-screen. We're talking about a movie you might not have even heard of, because very few people have actually seen it, or will ever see it for that matter, because it's practically lost. In fact, Spielberg himself calls it one of the worst films ever made. But he can sort of be forgiven. After all, he made it when he was only 17. Firelight screened at a single Phoenix movie theater and allegedly made $1 in profit off its $500 budget, which is not bad for a first try. We can't really dissect it as a whole because only 3 minutes of footage still exist, but what we do know can tell us a lot about Spielberg's cinematic foundations as a kid who was born around the time of the Roswell incident and grew up during the subsequent wellspring of conspiracies in popular media. As far as we can tell, Firelight feels inspired by both the Twilight Zone and UFO B pictures from the 1950s. It's steeped in their specific flavor of Cold War paranoia and nuclear age skepticism against the US government, with a character trying desperately to convince the CIA that aliens, represented by firelights in the sky, are actually real. But what is probably more revealing is that even at 17, Spielberg was already making movies centering on couples with marital problems, in this case, in the form of a cheating husband. If you've seen his 2022 semi-autobiography, The Fabelmans, or pretty much anything he's ever made, you'll know that unhappy marriages are a huge part of Spielberg's movies, because by the time he made Firelight as a teenager, his parents had already been divorced for a couple of years. Even before he had the budget to make a splash, his stories tried to combine epic spectacle with the intimate domestic scenarios he knew best. Of course, just throwing what you know at what you imagine doesn't make a good movie, but by the time Spielberg returned to these ideas over a decade later, he had figured out a strange, melancholy, and surprising empathetic way to refashion a tale of divorce into one of fascination with the unknown. Inspired by his father showing him a meteor shower when he was a kid, Close Encounters of the Third Kind saw Spielberg returning to the story of Firelight and even recreating certain scenes shot for shot, according to the biography by Joseph McBride. There's also a bit of Stanley Kubrick to be found in the visual department, since at the time Spielberg was making Close Encounters, the influence of 2001: A Space Odyssey would have been hard to ignore. While it began as a short story called Experiences about young couples at a lover's lane seeing mysterious lights in the sky, it would eventually be combined with Spielberg's idea to make a documentary, or a low-budget feature, about people who strongly believed in UFOs. Its original title was Watch the Skies, borrowed from a line in the 1951 sci-fi horror The Thing from Another World.
Tell the world. Tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies.
But by the early 70s, under Taxi Driver screenwriter Paul Schrader, it nearly became a story about blowing the supposed lid off Project Blue Book, a U.S. Air Force study in the 50s and 60s about the protocol for observing UFOs, which seems more in line with Disclosure Day. And while Close Encounters eventually used some of these ideas, like the heavy government presence, the final movie ended up pretty different from where it began, by focusing on the abduction of a young boy, and more importantly, a father who becomes so obsessed with the idea of UFOs that he leaves his wife and kids to hang out with legendary filmmaker Francois Truffaut. Oh, and to kiss another woman. As a child, it was Spielberg's understanding that his own father simply walked out on his family. However, the real truth of his mother's affair wouldn't come out until he was a teen. But even in his late 20s, he was using cinema as a way to channel complicated feelings about his family history. In Close Encounters, Roy Neary, played by Richard Dreyfuss, begins experiencing psychic visions of a mysterious mountain after his encounter with the lights, which makes him essentially leave his family behind to help the abducted toddler's mother. Coming from a director who resented his father for leaving, it feels like a fairy tale that projects a complicated sympathy onto Neary, giving him a good enough reason to leave, exploring the mysteries of the universe. There's also a bit of Spielberg himself in some of Neary's obsessions, like the introduction of a train set, which Neary later uses to depict the images he couldn't get out of his head, much like Spielberg's childhood experience of recreating the train crash from Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth. It feels in some ways like Spielberg trying to understand his own father based on his teenage understanding of his parents' marriage, and in some ways even why his own mother may have been compelled to leave in search of happiness elsewhere. For Spielberg, joy seems to lie in creating fantastical images of the universe, so having his characters chase those dreams somewhere out there in space makes perfect sense, even though it also ends up being the story of a man leaving his family. It's bittersweet. Now, how much of his parental projection is intentional is anybody's guess. In fact, when interviewed on Inside the Actor's Studio, it was the first time that some of these ideas even occurred to Spielberg, like how communicating with the aliens through computerized music is a rich combination of his mother's work as a pianist and his father's as a computer engineer, which eventually end up played on a massive cinema-sized screen.
Your father was a computer scientist. Your mother was a musician. When the spaceship lands, how do they communicate?
That's a very good question. I like that. You've answered the question.
They make music on their computers, and they are able to speak to each other, aren't they?
And you see, I'd love to say, you know, I intended that, and I realized that was my mother and father, but not until this moment.
Regardless of intent, Close Encounters is a deeply personal, deeply spiritual film to the point of drawing on religious imagery. But replacing heaven and the afterlife with dazzling spaceships as people walk toward the light, Spielberg also seems to replace God and angels with aliens as a way to understand humanity's place in the grand scheme of things. Some scenes directly reference Spielberg's influences, like DeMille's The Ten Commandments, which seem to inspire the way he uses matte paintings of landscapes and clouds converging overhead. Close Encounters might even be the closest thing Spielberg has made to a religious epic. The first time we actually see the aliens, the idea that they represent some divine forgiveness or salvation is extremely overt, as though Spielberg was using the genre to find answers to the mysteries in his own life by answering the question of why someone would be so spiritually compelled to abandon their family. Surely they must have a good enough reason. But if using UFOs to channel childhood anxieties wasn't clear enough, Spielberg's next alien story made things pretty direct. With his 1982 hit E.T. the Extra Terrestrial, Spielberg practically created a new way of depicting kids in American cinema, as little adventurers exploring the vastness of suburbia. But, of course, the all-ages tearjerker was about much more than just kids on bicycles against faceless government suits shot like the adults in Tom and Jerry. While some believe E.T. was inspired by The Alien, an unproduced script by Indian filmmaking legend Satyajit Ray, Spielberg maintains he had never read the draft that had circulated in Hollywood for several years, even though Ray's description of the alien as a cross between a gnome and a malnourished refugee matches what Spielberg would eventually do with E.T. Still, what ends up on the screen is distinctly Spielbergian no matter what, so for now, we'll take him at his word. According to McBride's biography, a young Spielberg dealt with his parents' separation by turning to an imaginary alien friend, which essentially makes E.T. a childhood dream come to life.
I've been wishing for this since I was 10 years old.
Like Close Encounters, E.T. is a story of suburban mundanity, interrupted by the arrival of UFOs. Only this time, Spielberg tells it from the perspective of a child whose father has already left the family for another woman. It is, in some ways, a thematic successor. This tale of divorce from a kid's perspective unfolds quietly in the background, but it underscores the emotions that young Elliot feels when he first meets the titular alien, making E.T. a story about yearning for a friend or protective figure. In fact, Elliot even first meets E.T. by throwing a baseball his way into the empty space where his dad should be. While E.T. himself may not be imposing or traditionally masculine or paternal, the kids dress him up in their father's old clothes, and he becomes a conduit for Elliot and for Spielberg himself to channel the lingering sensations of yearning for someone only to lose them and feel abandoned by them. This film's wish fulfillment is so powerful that it not only takes the form of magical flight, but religious euphoria. With a resurrected E.T. designed in the vein of the resurrected Christ, robes and all, combining questions of science fiction with questions of faith once again. The aliens in Spielberg's films may be flesh and blood, and in E.T.'s case, about 26% beer, but they exist to fill spiritual holes in their characters' lives. While Spielberg would eventually go on to wear his faith on his sleeve, he spent his early years turning away from religion in his personal life, which makes his overt use of religious imagery and biblical epics on screen all the more interesting, as if he were using cinematic depictions of things he doesn't fully believe to better understand their utility or their place in people's lives. The more he mapped them onto significant personal experiences similar to his own, the more real they became, like accepting that sometimes you have to say goodbye. As it happens, making E.T. turned out to be a significant personal experience too, since Spielberg cites it as the film that finally made him want to have children, a story he recreates in Jurassic Park. Intentional or not, Spielberg's alien stories are closely tied to the journey of parenthood. After all, how can you not think about your future and what you leave behind when you're forced to confront your place in the universe? It would be nearly 2 decades until Spielberg returned to anything resembling aliens on the big screen, by which point he'd had 7 kids in the 80s and 90s. So it's safe to say that by the time the new millennium arrived, the king of all ages cinema might have had a slightly different or slightly more evolved view on family ties. Which brings us to his next big alien adventure steeped in religious ideas.
But in the beginning, didn't God create Adam to love him?
Despite the similarity of its title structure to E.T. the Extra Terrestrial, AI artificial intelligence doesn't actually have any aliens in it. At least, not the kind from outer space, even though some of you might remember the final act featuring slender, alien-like creatures. Those were actually advanced robots from 2,000 years in the future, which had evolved from the ones we created in the movie's present. However, their similarity to aliens might not have been an accident, and may have been suggested by Spielberg's visual language much earlier when he first introduces David, the artificial boy created for parents whose son was in a coma. The first time we see David, he's out of focus and appears as a lanky silhouette, not unlike the way Spielberg depicted the aliens in Close Encounters. And while Spielberg mapped a tale of childhood yearning onto an alien in E.T., this is arguably when he flipped the script, through his tale of parents who fear they may not be able to love their child the way he deserves, because of his unfamiliar alien nature. David is programmed with a single goal: to be loved by his mother Monica. But this love is not something she's capable of returning the same way. A parental anxiety Spielberg channels through yet another sci-fi story. Only this time, it's hard not to read the film as a product of both a young parent and an adult who, after his own parents' divorce, learned that he was abandoned by his mother. The story of AI long predates Spielberg's involvement. In fact, it's something that Stanley Kubrick had been trying to adapt since the 1970s, and probably would have if he hadn't died in 1999. But what makes AI so powerful, as a specifically Spielbergian film, is the sincerity at its heart, which comes from a personal and painful place. For instance, listen closely to the score when David returns to a version of his home after 2,000 years. It's the first time John Williams' music is stripped down to its fundamentals, with the use of a single instrument. Many people attribute AI's saccharine final act to the melodrama maestro, but David getting to experience one last day with his mother was always a part of Kubrick's script. This climax even bears similarities to the invisible aliens in Kubrick's 2001, creating a room to observe an astronaut named Dave. As it turns out, it was some of the seedier elements of AI, like the red light district city home to Gigolo Joe, that were Spielberg's additions, as a world too big and too complicated for the eyes of a child. But the way Spielberg captures David's innocent yearning to be a real boy so he can be loved by his mother fills the frame with beautiful curiosity. As for the not aliens near the end of the film, they're foreshadowed early on as things we've left behind. This explanation can't help but read like the anxieties of a baby boomer, once the radical hippie generation whose rapid expansion felt like it would usher in a utopia, but who ended up responsible for climate change and other catastrophes. What are the ethics of bringing a child, real or otherwise, into a world you've already killed? This is a key part of what makes AI tick, as a story steeped in fears associated with having children, especially losing them. The idea of creations meant to outlive us is a devastating expression of parenthood itself. The notion that what we create ends up saddled with our fears, our flaws, and our projections of encroaching morality in a dying world, whether they like it or not. But once you pull on that thread a little further, it also becomes an expression of artistry itself. The idea that what we create will last long beyond us. And in Spielberg's case, it's these sci-fi toys and cinematic aliens that will carry on his legacy. Despite setting the film in a world destroyed by human hubris, there's a kind of utopian beauty to the evolved robots in the final act, who communicate and share images as a hive mind, practically showing each other movies of David's memories. Backing up the idea that for Spielberg, these robots and alien beings are manifestations of his own creativity, and perhaps even his need to create something that alienates him from other people. There's a kind of purity to AI that makes it one of Spielberg's most touching modern works, but it also came out at the last possible time when he could have, or would have, made a movie of its kind. By the time he directed his next Alien feature, just 4 years later, the world would have irreversibly changed. War of the Worlds represents a full-circle moment for Spielberg. The story, written by H.G. Wells, dates back to the 19th century, while the famous radio play by Orson Welles was broadcast in 1938. But Spielberg's version pays frequent homage to the 1953 film adaptation by Byron Haskin, another 50s sci-fi landmark steeped in Cold War paranoia and the kind of movie that inspired Spielberg's earlier works. It's worth noting that when Spielberg and George Lucas were writing the fourth Indiana Jones in the mid-90s, the success of Roland Emmerich's Independence Day made Spielberg turn away from the idea of using aliens on screen. But this didn't necessarily apply to his adaptation of War of the Worlds. See, Independence Day was probably the last moment in time that widespread destruction of an American metropolis could be digested as turn-your-brain-off entertainment. Because after the events of September 11, 2001, this was something that became all too real. Some movies alluded to 9/11 and its aftermath, but Spielberg's War of the Worlds was the first Hollywood production to approach imagery reminiscent of the attacks in head-on fashion. It's a film whose story opens with the New York skyline, about working people gathered on the streets covered in dust and ash, and it's about a country gone mad with fear and desperation after being attacked. Not to mention a film in which jet engines and similar technology are the source of unimaginable destruction. The Spielberg face has come to refer to people looking up in awe, but in War of the Worlds, they look up in horror instead. They capture horrifying images on cell phones and video cameras, not unlike the way the world experienced 9/11, and they search for their loved ones amidst rubble. And just in case you miss why the movie looks the way it does, Spielberg pretty much comes right out and tells you. Hey, you can't accuse the guy of being too subtle. Gone were the days of Spielberg's aliens being friendly, ethereal beings. Gone was the fascination and wonder, and gone were the religious and spiritual overtones brought on by questions of who else might be out there and what they might have to say about us in return. War of the Worlds is Spielberg at his most cynical about humanity, at a time when it seemed like the only things possible were war and anger.
We get back at them!
But in true Steven Spielberg fashion, War of the Worlds is also about children of divorce. Only this time, this is a default backdrop instead of the central tension. And maybe the film is a little worse for it. At times it can be too simple and straightforward, with events happening around Tom Cruise's Ray Ferrier in ways he can't influence or affect. But this also adds to the sense of helplessness running throughout the film, making it a story about a father who, no matter how hard he tries, can't protect his kids from the horrors of the world.
So close your eyes on Hushabye Mountain. Wave goodbye to cares of the day.
In an intriguing change from previous versions, these horrors have already existed deep beneath the Earth's surface, as if this attack were an inevitability. Intentionally or not, it hints at a geopolitical complexity that many people weren't willing to accept in the mid-2000s. The idea that the attacks of September 11th were deeply rooted in America's own foreign policy and its actions abroad. This, in turn, gives parts of the opening prologue a whole new meaning, even though the words are taken directly from the book.
With infinite complacency, men went to and fro about the globe, confident of our empire over this world.
The aliens this time are far less human, which doesn't bode well for the movie as a political metaphor, but it does allow Spielberg to make the country's fears a little more abstract, and therefore a little more approachable at a time when patriotism was used to fuel invasions abroad. It allowed him to translate the sense of Cold War paranoia seen throughout his beloved 50s sci-fi into a more modern Gulf War paranoia, in which anger and grief are channeled in important ways. It may not be one of Spielberg's most polished works, but it's one of the most honest about the state of the world. And, given its similarities to some of his biggest childhood influences, it may also have opened the door to the next time he depicted aliens on screen. The fourth Indiana Jones is one of the less admired ones in the series, but it's also a film that, like many of Spielberg's classics, harkens back to his childhood influences while drawing from a specific place of adult experience. Like War of the Worlds and AI, it's about a parent looking back at his legacy and the world he leaves behind, which also makes it kind of a legacy sequel before these things were in vogue. Crystal Skull is set in the 1950s, at a time when alien B-movies were on the rise and were steeped in Cold War themes like nuclear fears, government mistrust, and Red Scare anti-communist sentiment, all of which Spielberg gets to incorporate here and in some cases deconstruct.
I'm a capitalist, and I pay.
The central MacGuffin is a psychic skull belonging to an extraterrestrial being, but deep down, the film is about the quest for knowledge and power, or knowledge as power, which proves to be the villain's undoing yet again. It's repetitive, sure, but there's a kind of beauty to Cate Blanchett's Irina being defeated by what could be one or maybe even a dozen powerful aliens who, like the future androids in AI, are a kind of hive mind, represented by the extremely blunt symbolism of them combining to form a single dude, like collectivism triumphing over individual ambition and hitting you over the head.
More powerful together than they can ever be apart.
But of course, to project a coherent ideology onto the series is a fool's errand, no matter how far left its screenwriter tends to lean. Because at the end of the day, its director is a man of personal, emotional vision, first and foremost. Crystal Skull is buoyed by its hero wrestling with the idea of being a father when he finally reunites with Marion Crane, his love interest from the first film, and when he learns that his sidekick Mutt is actually his son. Whether or not the film succeeds at centering these ideas emotionally, they're a constant undercurrent, and they occasionally touch on some of Spielberg's more familiar themes. Even some of the movie's most lampooned scenes are filled with meaning, like Indy escaping through a facsimile of modern American life filled with mannequins representing the kind of simple domestic life he's never had, or allowed himself to have, something a filmmaker might reckon with when he's away on lengthy shoots for months or years on end. And in a particular funny irony, these images of nuclear families are all destroyed by... Well, you get the idea. While War of the Worlds allowed Spielberg to transpose his childhood favorites onto the modern world, Crystal Skull allowed him to play in their specific sandbox, mirroring the circumstances that led to their creation. It was also the perfect venue for Spielberg to go back to basics, for better or worse, with extremely simple, streamlined alien and flying saucer designs, which may as well have been plucked from the early days of UFO paranoia when he was still a kid. It may not be the best Indiana Jones movie, but it's the only one set during Spielberg's lifetime. And it was made at a time when his own kids were entering their adult years, forcing him to question his own choices and his role in their upbringing, much like the aging Indiana Jones. But with Spielberg having handed his Back to Basics adventure series to a new director, this leaves the door open for more original genre experiments and explorations as he turns his attention to Disclosure Day, a movie which, according to actor Josh O'Connor, follows up the lingering questions introduced in Close Encounters and returns to the sci-fi inspirations that first allowed Spielberg to put stories of aliens and UFOs on the silver screen. The paranoia, the awe and wonder, the religious overtones, and the tales of childhood filtered through grand sci-fi spectacle are all threads he's woven throughout his work, which makes it incredibly exciting that at nearly 80 years of age, he's chosen to revisit the kind of story he's been telling in new and evolving ways ever since he was 17.